Have you ever judged someone by their appearance only to be completely shocked by the truth? This is the story of Thomas Miller, a humble dairy farmer from Iowa, who walked into a luxury car dealership one afternoon and turned the entire place upside down. At first, the salesman smirked, the receptionist rolled her eyes, and everyone whispered that he didn't belong there. But by the end of the day, Thomas would teach them a lesson they would never forget. A lesson so powerful that even today, people across the country still talk about it. And as you listen to this story, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were there? Thomas was a tall man in his late 50s, his skin tanned from years under the sun, his hands rough from milking cows every morning at 4 a.m. He wore faded jeans tucked into dusty work boots, and his red flannel shirt had a small tear on the sleeve. On his head sat a battered baseball cap that once bore the logo of his father's farm, Miller Dairy Co., a farm that had stood for 3 generations on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like Summit Motors, the most prestigious luxury car dealership in the city. The dealership's massive glass windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, showcasing vehicles that started at $100,000 and climbed into the millions. Sleek Mercedes, polished Lamborghinis, and the latest Teslas lined the showroom floor, their metallic paint jobs shining like mirrors under spotlights. Inside, the air smelled of leather and new engines. Jazz played softly in the background, and the sales staff, all dressed in tailored suits, stood in clusters, sipping espresso from the dealership's private barista station. Clients walked in wearing Rolex watches and designer sunglasses. It was a world of elegance, polish, and prestige. And into this world stepped Thomas Miller, smelling faintly of hay, with a quiet determination in his stride. At first, nobody took him seriously. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, glanced at him from behind her sleek glass desk, barely suppressing a smirk. She leaned toward her coworker and whispered, "Lost, maybe?" "Tractor dealerships down the road." They both chuckled. Thomas, unfazed, tipped his cap politely. "Good afternoon. I'd like to take a look at your cars," he said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who worked the land and didn't waste words. Kelly raised an eyebrow. "Sir, these are high-performance vehicles. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of our partner dealerships. They have more affordable options." Her words dripped with condescension. Several salesmen across the floor overheard and laughed quietly. One of them, a tall, sharply dressed man named Eric, strutted over with the confidence of someone who thought he already knew how the story would end. "Let me guess," Eric said with a smirk. "You're here to take a few pictures? Maybe tell your friends back home you saw a Ferrari up close? That's okay. We get a lot of that. But these cars?" He gestured grandly to the sleek machines. "They're not for everyone. They're investments. They're lifestyles." Thomas looked around slowly, his blue eyes scanning each vehicle. He didn't seem offended. If anything, he seemed curious, like he was testing the people more than the cars. "Do you take cow's milk as payment?" he asked suddenly, his face serious. The entire showroom erupted in laughter. Customers glanced over, confused but entertained. Eric slapped his hand against his leg, doubled over with amusement. Kelly nearly spit out her coffee. "Cow's milk? Oh, that's a new one," Eric sneered. "Sir, unless you've got a check for at least 6 figures in your pocket, I'm afraid you're wasting everyone's time." And just like that, Thomas became the butt of the dealership's joke. Everywhere he turned, eyes followed him with ridicule. People whispered, smirked, and shook their heads at the idea that a farmer could even dream of touching the steering wheel of one of those cars. But what they didn't know, what not a single one of them could have guessed, was that Thomas Miller wasn't just any farmer. His dairy business had grown quietly, steadily into one of the largest privately owned suppliers in the Midwest. He had contracts with multiple national grocery chains. His farm produced thousands of gallons of milk a day, and his land alone was worth tens of millions. But Thomas wasn't the kind of man who flaunted wealth. He lived simply, drove a rusty pickup, and cared more about the health of his cows than the shine of his shoes. To the world, he looked like a man scraping by, but in truth, he could buy every car in that dealership without blinking. And now, as laughter echoed around him, he felt something stir inside. Not anger, not pride, but a quiet, steady resolve. These people thought they knew his worth. They thought his clothes and his boots told the whole story. But they were about to learn that you should never measure a man's value by appearances. At that moment, Thomas smiled faintly to himself. He knew exactly what he was going to do. But before we continue with what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever walked into a place where people looked at you and decided you weren't good enough, simply because of how you looked? If so, type yes in the comments, because I know Thomas's story is going to resonate with you. The laughter in the dealership eventually subsided into smirks and sideways glances, but the sting of mockery hung heavy in the air. Thomas, however, stood there with the same calm expression he had carried when he first walked in. His eyes were steady, his shoulders relaxed, as though none of the jeers or sarcastic comments could penetrate him. Eric, still reveling in his self-declared victory, motioned toward a bright red Ferrari parked near the center of the showroom. "Why don't I give you a quick tour, sir? This beauty right here? It's worth more than your entire farm equipment should. It's got a V8 engine, 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. Do you even know what that means?" His words carried arrogance, designed not to inform, but to humiliate. He expected Thomas to be intimidated, maybe even embarrassed. But Thomas only stepped closer to the car, peering at it with genuine interest. "It means it's fast," Thomas replied simply. "But tell me, how often do your customers drive this kind of car through an Iowa winter? Snow, ice, slush, does it handle that? Or does it spend most of the time sitting in a heated garage?" Eric blinked, caught off guard by the question. He forced a laugh, brushing it aside. "Well, these cars are investments, like I said. They're not meant for muddy country roads. They're for people who live a certain lifestyle." Kelly, who had been watching the exchange from her desk, chimed in with a grin. "Exactly. These cars are for people who belong in places like this." She gestured vaguely around the sleek, polished showroom. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his face unreadable. "Interesting. So you're saying a person's worth is measured by their shoes and their jacket? Not by their word? Not by their work?" His question lingered in the air, longer than anyone expected. For a split second, Eric hesitated. Something about the way Thomas said it, firm, steady, almost fatherly, made him uncomfortable. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He cleared his throat and forced another smile. "Listen, sir, if you're just here to make a point, I think we've indulged enough. This is a business. Unless you've got serious money to spend, you're wasting everyone's time." Several customers nearby snickered, shaking their heads. One whispered, "What's a farmer doing here anyway?" Another said, "Probably just wants to sit in the cars and take selfies." Thomas heard it all, but he didn't flinch. He had been underestimated his whole life. He had walked into banks where managers told him he'd never get approved for a loan, only to later shake his hand when he paid it off early. He had attended community meetings where people looked down on him, only to eventually rely on his donations to fund local schools. Ridicule didn't hurt him anymore. It only revealed the truth about others. He turned back to Eric. "Well then," Thomas said quietly, "show me your best. If you think I don't belong here, prove it. Show me the car that you think no man like me could ever drive." The challenge caught Eric off balance. His smirk faltered for the first time, but pride pushed him forward. "Fine," he said, leading Thomas toward a black Lamborghini Aventador that sat under a spotlight, its curves as sharp as a blade. "This one is nearly $500,000. It's the crown jewel of our collection. You'd have to sign away your farm just to sit behind the wheel." Thomas ran his hand lightly along the hood, his touch gentle, almost reverent, as though he were inspecting one of his prize dairy cows. He looked at the car, then back at Eric. "It's a fine machine," he said softly. "But tell me, do you sell dreams here, or just cars?" Eric rolled his eyes. "Dreams don't pay bills. Money does." And then came the line that would later become infamous in Cedar Rapids, repeated in whispers long after that day. Thomas tilted his head slightly and asked, "And what if a man has both?" The room went silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling like dust. Eric laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Sir, please. You walked in here in boots that probably cost less than my tie. Be realistic. Cars like these fleets, like these, aren't bought by farmers. They're bought by CEOs, by hedge fund managers, by people who know what real money looks like." Thomas looked him dead in the eye. "You don't know what real money looks like until you've seen what a farm can produce. Every morning before dawn, I walk into a barn filled with hundreds of cows. Each one gives what it was created to give. And each gallon of milk puts food on tables across this country. That, young man, is real money. The kind that never sleeps, the kind that feeds families. Not all wealth wears a suit." The truth of his words hung in the air, though the staff tried to laugh it off. To them, he was still a farmer pretending to belong in a palace of chrome and leather. But Thomas knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just browsing cars. He was watching them reveal themselves, testing their patience, exposing their arrogance. And in that quiet, deliberate way, he was preparing for the moment that would turn their laughter into silence. But before I reveal what Thomas did next, let me ask you, have you ever been told you didn't belong somewhere? Have you ever had someone look at you and decide you weren't good enough, only for you to later prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments, because Thomas's moment of truth is coming, and I promise you, it's one you'll never forget. The atmosphere inside Summit Motors was shifting, though most of the staff didn't recognize it yet. They still laughed behind polished smiles, whispering jokes about the farmer in boots. But Thomas was no longer just observing. He was beginning to lead the conversation. His calm presence drew eyes, even from customers who had initially dismissed him. There was something unshakable about him, something that made you lean in when he spoke. Eric, still eager to prove himself superior, crossed his arms. "Look, mister, what did you say your name was again?" "Miller," Thomas replied. "Thomas Miller. Well, Mr. Miller," Eric said, emphasizing the name with smug exaggeration. "As entertaining as this has been, you and I both know you didn't come here to buy anything. You're wasting our time. This place," he waved a hand at the gleaming cars, "the spotless showroom, the espresso bar, the marble floor, isn't for people like you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the staff. Kelly hid a laugh behind her hand. Customers turned their backs, expecting Thomas to finally leave in humiliation. But Thomas didn't budge. He stepped closer to the Lamborghini, then toward a glossy black Mercedes S-Class, then over to the deep blue Tesla Model X. He studied each one carefully, his eyes moving with the practiced precision of a man who had spent his life evaluating value, not in numbers on a screen, but in livestock, land, and machinery. Finally, he turned to Eric. "Tell me," Thomas asked, his voice steady, "how many cars do you keep in stock at this dealership?" Eric blinked. "What? What does that matter?" "It matters because I like to know my options," Thomas said simply. "So tell me, how many?" Eric scoffed. "We have around 40 vehicles on this floor, and in our private garage." "Why?" Thomas nodded. 40. He said the number as though he were already filing it away in his head, the way a farmer might mentally calculate the number of acres to seed, or the bales of hay in storage. "You've got to be kidding," Kelly muttered from behind the desk. 40 cars? He can't even afford one. But Thomas ignored her. He kept his eyes on Eric. "And what's the average price of each?" "Ballpark." Eric raised an eyebrow, smirking again. "Well, depends on the car. Our least expensive is around 90,000. The Aventador is 500. A few others closer to $1 million. Average? Maybe 200,000, give or take." Thomas nodded again, silent, thoughtful. He rubbed his chin, as though doing a calculation in his head. "So 40 cars average 200,000 apiece. That's about 8 million. The room went quiet. The words slipped out of his mouth so casually, so matter-of-fact, that for the first time, people weren't sure if he was joking. $8 million, said like someone who could actually reach into his pocket and make it happen. Eric let out a forced laugh. "Sir, forgive me, but this isn't an auction at the county fair. You can't just throw numbers around like that. These are luxury vehicles. Real money." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Do you think the milk in your coffee this morning wasn't real money? Do you think the cheese on your burger last night didn't come from a farm like mine? People eat, people drink, and every day my farm delivers. That's real money. But you wouldn't understand that because you've never had to work for it with your hands." Something in his tone struck deeper than before. It wasn't angry. It was firm, steady, and true. For the first time, Eric shifted uncomfortably. Kelly stopped typing at her desk, her smirk fading. Even a few customers who had laughed earlier now looked at Thomas differently. He walked slowly across the showroom, his boots echoing against the marble. He stopped beside a silver Porsche and tapped its hood lightly. "Nice car," he said. Then he pointed toward the Tesla. "Nice one, too." He moved his finger across the floor, counting, almost like he was choosing livestock at an auction. Then, with a calmness that shook the room, Thomas looked directly at Eric and said, "I'll take them all." At first, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air, so bold and so outrageous that most thought they had misheard him. Kelly dropped her pen on the desk. A man sipping espresso in the corner coughed mid-drink. "All of them?" Eric repeated slowly, his voice wavering. Thomas nodded. "Every car in this dealership. Write it up." The silence that followed was unlike anything Summit Motors had ever known. The mockery was gone. The laughter was gone. In its place was shock, disbelief, and the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, his farmer wasn't joking. Eric stammered. "Sir, do you understand what you're saying? That's over $8 million. Thomas's face didn't change. "I know exactly what I'm saying." The room erupted. Staff members whispered frantically to each other. Kelly picked up the phone, as if ready to call the manager. Customers craned their necks, desperate to see what would happen next. It was chaos, but in the middle of it all, Thomas stood steady, calm, and sure. For the first time since he walked in, he wasn't the one being judged. He was the one holding all the power. And while everyone scrambled to process his words, Thomas already knew he had accomplished what he came here to do, to teach them that no man's worth can be measured by the dirt on his boots. But how exactly would he pull it off? Could a farmer really buy the entire fleet of Summit Motors? Or was he bluffing to make his point? Before I reveal what happens next, I want to hear from you. If you were standing in that dealership, watching Thomas declare he'd buy every car in sight, would you have believed him or laughed like everyone else? Comment below and tell me. Would you bet against the farmer? The words still hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. "I'll take them all. Employees froze mid-step, customers gawked, and Eric stood pale, his confident smirk shattered. For the first time since Thomas Miller had walked into Summit Motors, no one dared to laugh. But disbelief still clung to the room. Surely this had to be a bluff. A farmer, dressed in dusty boots and a flannel shirt, couldn't possibly buy 40 luxury vehicles in a single stroke. Kelly slammed the receiver down after, hastily calling the general manager. "Mr. Reynolds is coming," she hissed under her breath. Her eyes darted between Thomas and the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, as though hoping the manager would restore order to this absurd spectacle. Within minutes, the manager emerged. Robert Reynolds was a sharp man in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, with salt and pepper hair that screamed authority. His navy suit fit perfectly, his cufflinks gleamed, and his stride was that of someone used to making million-dollar deals. He scanned the room, immediately noticing the awkward silence and the unusual crowd gathered around Thomas. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Eric rushed forward. "Mr. Reynolds, this man, he's saying he wants to buy all of our cars. Every last one." He half laughed, trying to sound amused, though his voice trembled. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. He looked Thomas up and down, lingering on the boots, the flannel, the cap. "Is that true, sir? You're claiming you want to purchase our entire fleet?" Thomas met his gaze calmly. "I'm not claiming. I'm telling you. Draw up the contracts. I'll sign." A hush fell again. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Sir, with all due respect, this dealership doesn't deal in jokes. You understand that 40 vehicles means more than $8 million? "I understand," Thomas replied evenly. "Do you?" The question struck hard, and even Reynolds faltered for half a second. But he quickly recovered, his polished demeanor returning. "All right, then. If you're serious, let's see proof of funds. Bank statements, wire transfer capability, something tangible." Everyone leaned in. This was the moment. Would the farmer be exposed as a fraud, or would he deliver on his promise? Thomas reached into his worn leather wallet, pulled out a black, metal, American Express Centurion card, the kind reserved only for the wealthiest of the wealthy, and placed it firmly on the counter. The staff gasped audibly. Even Eric stepped back, his face draining of color. Reynolds' eyes widened slightly, though he quickly tried to hide his reaction. "That's impressive," he admitted. "But a card doesn't prove you can cover $8 million. Without a word, Thomas pulled out his phone. Calmly, he opened his banking app, turned the screen toward Reynolds, and showed a balance that made jaws drop. Multiple accounts, each stacked with 7-figure totals. His main business account alone boasted more than $12 million in liquid funds. The room fell silent. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the faint jazz music from the speakers, and the sound of someone dropping a pen behind the receptionist's desk. Thomas's voice broke the silence. "This is the result of 3 generations of work. Early mornings, long nights, and faith that hard work pays off. You see dust on my boots, but I see the fruit of honest labor. I didn't come here to impress you. I came here to buy." And I said I'd take them all. The manager's lips parted, but no words came out. He glanced at the numbers again, then at the card, then back at Thomas. He realized in that moment that he wasn't dealing with a joke. He was dealing with a man who had just flipped the power dynamic of the entire dealership. Kelly's face flushed crimson. She avoided Thomas's gaze, ashamed of her earlier remarks. Eric stood frozen, his earlier arrogance now replaced with humiliation. Customers who had snickered when Thomas first walked in now stared at him with wide-eyed respect, as if they were witnessing a legend unfold before their very eyes. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," he said carefully, "if you're truly intent on making this purchase, it will take time to process the paperwork. It's unprecedented. We've never sold an entire inventory in one transaction. Thomas simply nodded. Then you'd better get started. The staff scrambled. Papers rustled, printers whirred, phones buzzed. The dealership, once so smug and composed, now buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone wanted to be the one to assist Thomas Miller, the farmer who had just proven he was worth more than any assumption, more than any stereotype. As he stood there, arms folded, watching the chaos he had set in motion, Thomas thought of his father and grandfather, men who had worked the same land with far fewer opportunities. They had taught him that humility and persistence outlast arrogance. And today, in the middle of a luxury dealership, their lesson rang truer than ever. He wasn't buying cars. He was buying respect, and everyone in that building knew it. But the question remained, would he really go through with it? Would Thomas Miller truly sign his name to purchase every last car in the dealership? Or was this a powerful demonstration meant to humble them? That answer was coming, and it would shake Summit Motors to its very foundation. Before I reveal what Thomas decided to do, I want to hear from you. If you had the means, would you have gone through with buying the whole fleet to prove a point? Or would you have walked away, satisfied that you'd already taught the lesson? Type fleet in the comments if you'd buy them all, or walk if you'd leave them stunned but empty-handed. The flurry of activity inside Summit Motors looked more like Wall Street than a luxury car dealership. Sales reps rushed between desks, finance officers clutched clipboards, and the dealership manager barked out orders with nervous urgency. Papers piled high, printers spat out contracts by the dozen, and the entire staff was consumed by one extraordinary task, preparing the sale of an entire fleet of luxury cars. And at the center of it all sat Thomas Miller, calm, unshaken, watching. The farmer who had walked in hours earlier, dismissed as a joke, now commanded the room. Even the customers who had once chuckled at him stuck around, unable to tear themselves away from the unfolding spectacle. Every eye tracked his every move. One by one, contracts were placed in front of him. One by one, Thomas signed, his pen moving steadily across the pages. The scratching of ink against paper became the rhythm of justice, each signature silencing the last remnants of doubt in the room. Eric stood in the corner, pale as chalk, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced with the sting of humiliation. Just hours before, he had sneered at Thomas, mocking the idea that a farmer could even test drive a single car. Now, that same farmer was about to own every vehicle Eric had once bragged about selling. Kelly, the receptionist, sat behind her desk, avoiding eye contact. Her earlier smirk haunted her now. She thought of the way she had belittled him, telling him luxury cars weren't for people like him. Shame burned in her chest, and for the first time, she realized how cruel her words had been. Robert Reynolds, the manager, paced near Thomas's table. He kept glancing at the contracts, then at Thomas's calm demeanor. Part of him still couldn't believe this was real, but the mounting stack of signed agreements and the confirmed bank transfers told him otherwise. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last page was signed. Thomas set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and looked around the room. The silence was deafening. "It's done," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying both awe and disbelief. "Thomas Miller now owns the entire fleet of Summit Motors." Gasps rippled through the room. The customers erupted in whispers. Phones were raised to capture photos and videos, and the staff shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their humiliation. Thomas stood. His presence filled the space, not because of his height or his clothes, but because of the undeniable respect he now commanded. He turned to Eric first. "You looked at me and saw dirt on my boots," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "But what you didn't see was the years of sweat and sacrifice behind those boots. You thought wealth had to wear a suit, but real wealth doesn't need to prove itself." Eric lowered his gaze, unable to respond. The sting of truth hit harder than any insult ever could. Thomas then turned to Kelly. And you told me people like me didn't belong here. But let me tell you something, hard work belongs everywhere. And so does respect. Never forget that the person you dismiss might be the very one writing the check that keeps the lights on. Kelly's eyes watered. She nodded slightly, words trapped in her throat. Finally, Thomas faced the entire dealership. His voice carried, steady and unwavering. I didn't buy these cars because I needed them. I bought them to remind every single one of you, and maybe even some watching, that respect isn't determined by the clothes you wear or the dirt under your fingernails. It's earned by the life you live and the work you do. The crowd was silent, captivated. Thomas reached for his hat, adjusted it slightly, and with a faint smile added, and in case you're wondering, yes, I'll be paying with the proceeds of cow's milk. Turns out it's more valuable than you thought. The room erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause. Customers clapped, some cheered, and even a few staff members joined in reluctantly, acknowledging the lesson they'd just received. Reynolds stepped forward, extending a hand. Mr. Miller, on behalf of Summit Motors, congratulations. And I apologize for the way you were treated. Thomas shook his hand firmly. Apology accepted. Just make sure the next farmer who walks in here doesn't have to go through what I did. With that, Thomas walked toward the massive glass doors. The sunlight streamed in, catching the dust on his boots like a badge of honor. Outside, the lot gleamed with row upon row of luxury vehicles that now belonged to him. He paused for a moment, looking back at the stunned faces inside the dealership. Remember, he said with a faint smile, never underestimate someone just because they don't fit your evolve success. Then he pushed the doors open and stepped out, leaving behind a dealership forever changed. That day, Summit Motors learned a lesson it would never forget. Respect every person who walks through your doors, because you never know if they're carrying dust. Or destiny. And Thomas Miller, he didn't just buy cars. He bought dignity. He bought respect. And he proved, once and for all, that true wealth isn't measured by appearances. It's measured by character. Now it's your turn, watching this story unfold. If you were in Thomas's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have signed every contract to teach the ultimate lesson? Or would you have walked away, leaving them stunned but humbled? Comment below. I want to hear your answer. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Share this video with a friend, and join us for more powerful stories of resilience, dignity, and unexpected triumphs. Because sometimes the most underestimated people turn out to be the most unforgettable. The roar of applause faded as Thomas Miller stepped out into the sunlight. The air was crisp, the sky stretched wide above him, and in front of him gleamed the endless row of luxury cars he now owned. Lamborghinis shimmered in neon green and orange, Ferraris gleamed in crimson, and black-tinted Cadillacs stood like silent sentinels. The dealership lot had transformed into his personal kingdom of horsepower and chrome. The crowd followed, spilling out of the dealership doors, still buzzing with disbelief. Some held up phones, recording every step Thomas took, knowing they had just witnessed something no one would believe without proof. But while everyone else gawked at the cars, Thomas's eyes softened. He wasn't staring at the polished hoods or the glossy rims. He was remembering the faces of the farmhands who worked beside him every dawn, the single mothers in his town struggling to get to work in run-down vehicles, the high school kids who walked miles because they couldn't afford a ride. These cars weren't about him. They were about them. The dealership manager, Robert Reynolds, rushed out, looking bewildered. Mr. Miller, the fleet is yours now. We'll begin preparing the titles and registrations immediately. Do you want us to arrange transportation to your farm? We can't possibly deliver all of these in a single day. Thomas chuckled, tipping his hat back. Don't bother, Reynolds. I won't be keeping most of these. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People leaned in, straining to catch his words. What do you mean? Reynolds asked, confused. Thomas took a deep breath and raised his voice so everyone could hear. I bought this fleet not to fill my garage, but to fill lives. For too long, people have looked down on folks like me, like us. Today, I'm turning that insult into opportunity. He pointed toward the line of cars. Some of these vehicles will go back home with me, sure. But the rest? They're going to people who need them more than I ever could. The single moms who walk to double shifts. The young men and women working 2 jobs to support their families. The neighbors who've been told they'll never rise above their circumstances. These cars are theirs now. A stunned silence swept across the lot before the first cheer broke out. And another. Then dozens more, until the sound of applause and cries of joy echoed against the dealership walls. Strangers hugged. Phones lit up as people live-streamed the announcement. Thomas turned toward the staff, his eyes locking on Eric and Kelly. Respect should never be sold at a price tag. I came here today to buy cars, but what I'm leaving with is bigger than that. I'm leaving with a reminder to myself, to all of you, and maybe to everyone watching, that you measure a person by their heart, not their shoes. Eric's face burned red, his pride crushed under the weight of Thomas's generosity. Kelly covered her mouth, tears rolling freely now. For the first time, she realized just how small her earlier arrogance had been. One by one, families from the small town began to gather as word spread. Some cried as Thomas handed them keys to Cadillacs. Others trembled in disbelief as he placed them behind the wheel of brand-new SUVs. A young woman clutched her toddler in her arms, sobbing as Thomas told her she'd never again have to walk miles in the freezing Ohio winter to reach work. Reporters swarmed, capturing every moment, broadcasting the farmer's story to the nation. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Humble farmer buys luxury fleet, gives cars away to needy families. By evening, the lot was almost empty. Where once stood rows of untouched luxury vehicles, now sat gaps filled, instead with hope, dignity, and second chances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas climbed into the driver's seat of a black Cadillac Escalade, the one he decided to keep for his family. His calloused hands gripped the leather wheel, but his heart wasn't focused on the car. It was on the people he'd just lifted up, the smiles he just created, the lesson he'd just delivered. Before driving off, he rolled down the window, looked back at the stunned dealership staff, and said, "Remember this day. Because the next time someone like me walks through those doors, you'll know that worth isn't always wrapped in a suit. Sometimes it's wrapped in overalls, mud, and calluses. Don't forget it." He tipped his hat once more, and eased the Cadillac onto the road, leaving behind a dealership forever changed. The story of Thomas Miller spread like wildfire across America. Farmers cheered, families wept with gratitude, and strangers debated online. Some argued he should have kept the cars. Others praised his generosity. And countless people admitted they'd never look at a simple farmer the same way again. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the cars, not the headlines, but the shift in perspective that success has many faces. And respect is the one thing no amount of money can buy. So now I ask you, watching this story unfold, if you were Thomas, what would you have done? Kept the fleet as a trophy to prove everyone wrong, or given it away as a gift to prove everyone right about what true wealth really is? Comment below and let your voice be heard. And if Thomas's story inspired you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share this video with a friend. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. And let's keep spreading the message that dignity, resilience, and heart will always outshine arrogance and prejudice. Because sometimes the man in boots walks out with more than cars. He walks out with respect and leaves the world with hope.